The rope burned against Josie Zimmerman's wrists as the town marshal dragged her through the dusty streets of El Dorado, California. And she knew with terrible certainty that this morning might be her last. The September sun of 1872 beat down mercilessly on her bare head, her bonnet having been knocked off during the rough arrest, and she could feel dozens of hostile eyes watching from every window and doorway as she stumbled forward. Behind her, angry voices rose in a crescendo of accusation and threat, each one cutting deeper than any physical wound could. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being paraded like a criminal toward what she suspected would be a very short trial and an even shorter rope. "You think you can steal from honest folk and get away with it?" Marshal Garrett spat the words over his shoulder, his meaty hand gripping her arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Think because you are a woman we will go easy on you." "I did not steal anything," Josie protested for what felt like the 100th time that morning, her voice hoarse from crying and shouting her innocence. "Please, you have to believe me. I have never taken anything that was not mine in my entire life." The marshal ignored her completely, dragging her up the 3 wooden steps of the makeshift courthouse that doubled as a saloon most evenings. The building smelled of stale beer and tobacco, and the crowd that had followed them from the mercantile now pushed inside, filling every available space with their angry presence. Josie's legs trembled beneath her skirts, and she fought against the wave of dizziness that threatened to pull her under. This could not be happening. Just yesterday, she had been worried about whether her vegetable garden would survive the early autumn chill, and now she was fighting for her very life. The accusations had started 3 days ago when old Mrs. Peterson claimed her pearl necklace had gone missing after Josie had visited to deliver the mending she had taken in. Then Mr. Crawford at the general store reported that his cash box was short $20 after Josie had been shopping for flour and sugar. This morning, the final straw had been when the banker's wife discovered her gold wedding band missing from her dressing table, and 3 people swore they had seen Josie near the banker's house around that time. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but in a small mining town like El Dorado, where everyone knew everyone else's business, reputation meant everything. Once the whispers started, they spread like wildfire through dry grass. Judge Hammond took his seat behind a scarred wooden table that served as the bench, his face stern and unyielding. He was a hard man who had seen too many thieves and criminals pass through his court, and Josie could tell from the set of his jaw that he had already made up his mind about her guilt. Her heart sank like a stone in her chest. There would be no justice here today, only vengeance for crimes she had not committed. "Josie Zimmerman, you stand accused of theft from multiple upstanding citizens of this town," Judge Hammond intoned, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Josie said as firmly as she could manage, though her voice shook. "I swear on my mother's grave I never stole anything from anyone. I have been working honest jobs since I came to this town 2 years ago, taking in washing and mending, and I have never once—" "We have witnesses," the judge interrupted, shuffling through papers in front of him. "Multiple witnesses who place you at or near the scene of each theft. Mrs. Peterson says her necklace disappeared the very day you were in her home. Mr. Crawford keeps meticulous records, and the money went missing on a day when you were one of only 3 customers. And this morning, 3 separate people saw you walking past the banker's residence right around the time his wife's ring vanished. Being near something is not the same as stealing it," Josie cried out, her composure finally cracking. "I visit Mrs. Peterson every week to bring her mending. I shop at Crawford's store like everyone else in town. and I walk past dozens of houses every day because I live in this town. None of that makes me a thief, the crowd murmured, but Josie could hear the hostility in their voices. They wanted someone to blame, someone to punish, and she was convenient. A woman alone, with no family to speak for her, no husband to defend her honor. She had thought El Dorado was her fresh start after losing her parents to cholera back in Missouri. She had thought she could build a quiet, honest life here in the California foothills. How naive she had been. If the court pleases. A new voice rang out from the back of the room, deep and commanding enough to silence the murmuring crowd instantly. I have testimony that might shed some light on this matter. Every head turned to see who had spoken, and Josie's breath caught in her throat at the sight of the man pushing his way through the crowd. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they nearly brushed people on either side as he moved forward. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, fell past his collar in thick waves that suggested he spent more time in the wilderness than in barber shops. His face was weathered and tanned from long hours in the sun, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that held Josie transfixed, a piercing gray that seemed to see right through all the lies and accusations to the truth beneath. She had seen him around town occasionally over the past few months, always from a distance. The other women whispered about him when he came down from the mountains to trade his furs and buy supplies. They called him Dalton Lang, said he lived alone up in the high country, trapping and hunting, keeping to himself. Some claimed he was running from something, while others insisted he was just a man who preferred solitude to society. Josie had never spoken to him, had never been close enough to see the raw strength in the muscles of his arms or the way his presence seemed to fill the entire room with an almost palpable energy. "And who might you be?" Judge Hammond asked, clearly annoyed at the interruption but unable to dismiss such an imposing figure out of hand. "Dalton Lang," the mountain man replied, coming to stand beside Josie at the front of the room. Up close, he smelled of pine trees and leather and something wild that made her pulse quicken despite her terror. "I trap in the mountains above town, and I have been coming into El Dorado for supplies for the better part of 5 years now." "We know who you are, Lang," the judge said impatiently. "What possible testimony could you have about these thefts? You spend most of your time miles from civilization." "That is true," Dalton agreed, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "But I have been in town more frequently these past few weeks, and I have seen things that make me certain Miss Zimmerman here is innocent of all charges." Hope flared in Josie's chest like a match struck in darkness. She turned to look up at him, and for just a moment their eyes met. Something passed between them in that brief glance, something electric and profound that she could not name. Then he was looking back at the judge, and she wondered if she had imagined it. "The day, Mrs. Peterson's necklace went missing. I was making a delivery of fresh venison to her home," Dalton continued. "She had requested it the week prior, said her husband was fond of my game. I arrived in the early afternoon after Miss Zimmerman had already left with her mending basket. Mrs. Peterson invited me in while she fetched payment, and I could not help but notice her son, Thomas, examining a pearl necklace in the hallway. He looked startled when he saw me watching him and quickly shoved it into his coat pocket." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thomas Peterson was known around town as a young man with expensive tastes and a gambling problem that his mother refused to acknowledge. Josie felt her knees weaken with relief, and she had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. "That is a serious accusation to make against young Peterson," Judge Hammond said, but there was a thoughtful look in his eyes now. "Do you have any proof of this?" "Only my word," Dalton said simply. But I have no reason to lie, and I have never been known as a dishonest man in all my dealings in this town. Check Thomas Peterson's room. Check the local pawn shops in Placerville and Sacramento. If he has his mother's necklace, I would wager he has other items as well, items he has been stealing and selling to cover his debts. Marshal Garrett shifted uncomfortably. Even if that is true about the necklace, it does not explain the missing money from Crawford's store or the banker's wife's ring. As for Crawford's missing money, Dalton said, and Josie heard something dangerous creep into his voice now. I was in the general store that same day, purchasing supplies for my winter stores. I came in right after Miss Zimmerman left, and I saw Mr. Crawford's nephew, Billy, behind the counter, counting bills from the cash box. When his uncle came back from the storeroom, Billy shoved several bills into his own pocket before Mr. Crawford could see. I did not think much of it at the time, figured it was family business and none of my concern. But now, hearing Miss Zimmerman accused of that theft, I cannot stay silent. Mr. Crawford stood up from his seat in the crowd, his face red with anger. You are calling my nephew a thief. Billy is a good boy. He would never check his pockets, Dalton interrupted, his gray eyes fixed on the store owner. Check his room. Ask him where he got the new boots he was wearing yesterday, the ones that cost more than you pay him in a month of work. The room erupted in conversation, voices rising and falling in waves of shock and speculation. Judge Hammond banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Josie felt tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of gratitude rather than fear. This stranger, this mountain man who barely knew her name, was risking his reputation and possibly his safety to speak the truth on her behalf. Why would he do such a thing? When the room finally quieted, the judge fixed Dalton with a penetrating stare. You seem to have witnessed quite a lot of criminal activity for a man who keeps to himself in the mountains. What about the banker's wife's ring? I suppose you have an explanation for that theft as well. I do, Dalton said firmly. This morning I was at the livery stable, checking on my horse before heading back up to my cabin. The stable is directly across from the banker's house, with a clear view of the side entrance. I saw a young woman approach the house, wearing a blue dress and a bonnet very similar to what Miss Zimmerman often wears. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then slipped in through the side door that the servants use. She was inside for perhaps 5 minutes before leaving quickly, again looking around to make sure she was not seen. But it was not Miss Zimmerman. How can you be so certain? Marshal Garrett demanded. If she was wearing similar clothes, because Miss Zimmerman was at the creek doing her washing at that exact time, Dalton said. I know this because I passed by on my way to the livery and saw her there, scrubbing clothes on the rocks. She called out a good morning to me, and I nodded in return. There is no way she could have been in 2 places at once. The woman I saw entering the banker's house was shorter and moved differently. It was someone deliberately trying to be mistaken for Miss Zimmerman. He paused, then added, I would suggest you look closely at Sarah Winters. She and her family moved to town about 6 months ago, and she bears a passing resemblance to Miss Zimmerman. She also happens to have been seen wearing new jewelry recently, pieces she claimed were gifts from a secret admirer. I would wager if you search her room, you will find Mrs. Peterson's necklace and the banker's wife's ring, along with God knows what else. The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Everyone in the room knew Sarah Winters, knew her family. They were respectable, or so it seemed. But Josie suddenly remembered encountering Sarah several times over the past months, remembered the way the younger woman had looked at her with something like calculation in her eyes. It had made Josie uncomfortable, but she had dismissed it as her own paranoia. Judge Hammond slowly rose from his seat. "Marshal Garrett, I want you to bring in Thomas Peterson, Billy Crawford, and Sarah Winters for questioning immediately. Search their rooms and their possessions. If Mr. Lang's testimony proves accurate, then we have a grave injustice to correct here today." He turned to Josie, and she saw something like shame in his weathered face. "Miss Zimmerman, you are free to go. I apologize for the treatment you have received. If these accusations prove true, the court will ensure your reputation is fully restored." The rope around Josie's wrists was cut, and she rubbed the raw skin, hardly daring to believe what was happening. The crowd began to disperse, many looking ashamed, others angry at having been deceived. But Josie barely noticed any of them. Her entire attention was focused on the man beside her, the mountain man who had saved her life with nothing but the truth. "Mr. Lang," she began, her voice breaking with emotion, "I do not know how to thank you. You did not have to speak up. You could have stayed silent and no one would have faulted you for it. But you risked your standing in this town to tell the truth for a woman you do not even know. I am forever in your debt." Dalton turned to look at her, and again she felt that jolt of connection, like lightning seeking ground. "I could not stay silent," he said simply. "I saw what was happening, saw you being blamed for things you did not do. The truth matters, Miss Zimmerman. Justice matters. I have seen too many innocent people suffer because good people stayed quiet." They walked out of the courthouse together into the bright California sunshine, and Josie felt as if she was seeing the world for the first time. The street that had seemed so hostile and threatening just an hour ago now looked merely like a street. The people who had been ready to see her hang now averted their eyes in shame. Everything had changed because one man had the courage to speak the truth. "Will you let me buy you dinner?" Josie asked impulsively. "It is the least I can do after what you have done for me." Dalton hesitated, and she saw something flicker across his face, a loneliness that called to her own. "I am not much for town socializing," he said slowly, "but I would not say no to a home-cooked meal if you are the one offering." "My cabin is just at the edge of town," Josie said quickly, hardly believing her own boldness. "Nothing fancy, but I can make a decent stew and I baked bread just yesterday." "Lead the way," Dalton said, and the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. As they walked through the town together, Josie became acutely aware of his presence beside her. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, his long strides forcing her to hurry slightly to keep pace. People stared as they passed, no doubt already spinning tales about the mountain man and the wrongly accused woman. Let them talk, Josie thought with a defiance that was new and exhilarating. After this morning, she cared very little about what the gossips of El Dorado thought. Her cabin sat on a small plot of land at the southern edge of town, backed by a stand of ponderosa pines that whispered in the afternoon breeze. It was humble but tidy, with a small garden in front that she had coaxed into reluctant productivity despite the rocky soil. Inside, everything was neat and spare, the possessions of a woman who owned little but took pride in what she had. Dalton had to duck slightly to enter through the doorway, and the cabin immediately seemed smaller with him in it. He looked around with those penetrating gray eyes, taking in the carefully swept floor, the colorful quilt on the narrow bed, the herbs hanging from the rafters to dry. "You have made a good home here," he said, and she heard approval in his voice. "Thank you," Josie said, suddenly nervous. She had been so bold inviting him back here, but now, alone with this powerful, attractive man, she felt very aware of her disheveled appearance and the impropriety of the situation. "Please sit. I will get the stew started." She busied herself at the hearth, rebuilding the fire and hanging her iron pot over the flames. The stew would not take long to heat, as she had made it the day before. As she worked, she felt Dalton's eyes on her, watching with an intensity that made her hands shake slightly as she cut bread and laid the table. "You have been alone in this town for 2 years?" Dalton asked after a long silence. "Yes," Josie confirmed, stirring the stew even though it did not need stirring. "My parents died of cholera in Missouri. I sold everything we owned and came west, hoping to find a place where I could start fresh. El Dorado seemed like a good place, not too big, not too small. I thought I could make an honest living here." "And you have," Dalton said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see you are a woman of character and integrity. Those thieves chose you to take the blame because you are alone, because they thought no one would defend you." "They were almost right," Josie said softly, turning to face him. "If you had not been there, if you had not spoken up, I would be in a jail cell right now awaiting execution. Or worse, they might have skipped the trial altogether and strung me up from the nearest tree." "I would not have let that happen," Dalton said, and there was such conviction in his voice that Josie believed him completely. "I have spent most of my adult life avoiding people, avoiding attachments. I learned young that people can be cruel and selfish, that trusting the wrong person can get you killed. So I went to the mountains where things are simpler, where a man's worth is measured by his skill and his strength, not by his words or his politics." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching on the rough wooden table. "But seeing you today, seeing your fear and your courage as they dragged you to that courthouse, something in me could not stay quiet. I have been silent too many times in my life, watched injustices happen and told myself it was not my business. Not today. Today I had to speak." Josie felt tears prick her eyes again. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table along with the bread, then sat down across from him. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Josie felt that connection again, stronger now. It was as if some invisible thread had been tied between them, drawing them together. "Tell me about your life in the mountains," she said, wanting to know everything about this man who had saved her. "It must be very different from living in town." As they ate, Dalton talked, and Josie listened with rapt attention. He told her about his cabin high in the Sierra Nevada, about the endless blue of the mountain lakes and the way the morning mist hung in the valleys like something out of a dream. He talked about tracking elk through deep snow, about outwitting wolves and cougars, about the profound silence that could be found in the wilderness, a silence that felt holy in its completeness. "I had a family once," he said quietly, his spoon pausing halfway to his mouth. "A younger sister named Mary. She was all I had after our parents died in a mining accident outside of Virginia City. I was 19, she was 15. I worked in the mines to support us, and I thought I was doing right by her, but I did not see how unhappy she was, how lonely. She fell in love with a man who seemed respectable, who promised her the world. I approved the marriage because I thought she would finally have the stable home she deserved." His jaw tightened, and Josie saw old pain flash across his face. "He turned out to be a monster. He beat her, controlled her every movement, took what little money she had. She was too ashamed to tell me the truth, and I was too blind to see it. By the time I realized what was happening, she was broken in spirit. She died giving birth to his child 3 years into the marriage, and the baby died with her. Her husband disappeared before I could confront him, which was probably for the best. I was in such a rage I would have killed him with my bare hands." "I am so sorry," Josie whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, the hand of a man who worked with his body every day. "That must have been unbearable." "It was," Dalton said simply. "I blamed myself for years." If I had been more attentive, more aware, I could have saved her. After she died, I could not stand to be around people anymore. Every face reminded me of my failure, so I went to the mountains and I stayed there. That was 8 years ago. But you still come to town for supplies, Josie pointed out gently. You have not completely cut yourself off from humanity. No, Dalton admitted. As much as I might want to, I cannot survive alone forever. And lately. He trailed off, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Lately, the solitude has felt more like loneliness. I find myself staying in town a day or two longer than necessary, watching people go about their lives, wondering what it would be like to be part of a community again. You are part of this community, Josie said firmly. What you did today proved that. You are a good man, Dalton Lang, whether you believe it or not. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face from stern and remote to warm and almost boyish. And you are a remarkable woman, Josie Zimmerman. You faced that mob with more courage than most men I have known. You did not back down or admit to crimes you did not commit, even when it would have been easier to just confess and beg for mercy. I could not confess to something I did not do, Josie said. My parents raised me to value truth above all else. They said a person's integrity is the one thing that cannot be bought or sold, only given away. I was not about to give mine away to make things easier for a lynch mob. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and then Dalton insisted on helping her clean up, carrying water from the well behind the cabin and washing the dishes while she dried. It was such a domestic scene, so ordinary and yet so extraordinary given the events of the morning. Josie found herself acutely aware of every brush of his arm against hers, every accidental touch of their hands as they worked side by side. I should get back to my horse, Dalton said eventually, though he made no move toward the door. I was planning to head back up to my cabin this afternoon, but after everything that happened. Stay in town tonight, Josie heard herself say. Please. I know you prefer solitude, but after today I find I do not want to be alone, not yet, and I sense you might feel the same. Dalton looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the battle between his ingrained habit of isolation and his growing desire for human connection. For connection with her, specifically. She could feel it in the air between them, this pull that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with something deeper, something neither of them was quite ready to name. I will stay, he said finally, but I will get a room at the boarding house. I do not want to compromise your reputation any more than it already has been today. To hell with my reputation, Josie said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. After this morning, after being dragged through the streets like a common criminal, I find I care very little what people think of me. But you are right to be cautious. I would not want people to think poorly of you because of me. People will think what they want regardless, Dalton said with a shrug. But I will still get that room, not because I care about gossip, but because you deserve respect. You deserve to be treated like the lady you are. The way he said it, with such simple conviction, made Josie's heart flutter in her chest. When was the last time anyone had treated her with such consideration? When had she felt this seen, this valued? Will you come back for breakfast? She asked, not wanting this unexpected connection to end. I make decent flapjacks, and I have real maple syrup I have been saving for a special occasion. I think today qualifies. I will be here at first light, Dalton promised, and the warmth in his gray eyes made her feel like she was standing too close to the fire. He left as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost too beautiful after the ugliness of the morning. Josie stood in her doorway watching him walk back toward the center of town, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the gathering dusk. She hugged herself, feeling the phantom warmth of his presence even though he was gone. That night, sleep was slow to come. Every time Josie closed her eyes, she saw herself back in that courthouse, felt the rough rope on her wrists, heard the angry voices calling for her punishment. But then she would remember Dalton's voice cutting through the chaos, calm and sure and truthful. She would remember the way he had looked at her, like she was someone worth saving, someone worth fighting for. She had been alone for so long, keeping everyone at arm's length because it seemed safer that way. After losing her parents, she had been terrified of caring for anyone again, of opening herself up to that kind of pain. But Dalton understood that fear. She had seen it in his eyes when he talked about his sister, heard it in the careful way he spoke about his isolation. He was protecting himself just as she had been protecting herself. And maybe, just maybe, they could be brave enough to stop protecting themselves quite so fiercely. Dawn came clear and cool, the early October air carrying the first real hint of the winter to come. Josie was up before the sun, building up her fire and mixing batter for flapjacks. She had washed her face and hands in the cold water from her basin, brushed and rebraided her dark brown hair, and put on her best calico dress, the one she usually saved for church on Sundays. She told herself she was not trying to look pretty for Dalton, that this was simply about looking presentable after yesterday's ordeal. But her racing heart knew the truth. He arrived just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, his knock soft but firm on her door. When she opened it, she found him freshly shaved, his long dark hair pulled back and tied with a leather cord. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance as well, wearing what looked like his best shirt, the blue fabric bringing out the gray of his eyes. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was warm honey, sliding over her skin and making her shiver despite the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Good morning," Josie replied, stepping back to let him in. "I hope you slept well at the boarding house." "Well enough," Dalton said, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. "Though I will confess I spent most of the night thinking about today, about what comes next." "What do you mean?" Josie asked, though her heart was already beginning to pound. Dalton moved further into the cabin, and again his presence seemed to fill the space completely. "Last night after I left you, I walked around this town for hours. I thought about going back to the boarding house trying to sleep, but my mind would not quiet. I kept thinking about you, about the way you faced down that mob with nothing but your integrity and your courage, about how alone you have been, how hard you have worked to build a life here. And I realized something." He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes pinned her in place. "I realized that for 8 years I have been hiding in the mountains, telling myself I preferred solitude, that I did not need anyone. But it was a lie. I was just afraid. Afraid of failing someone again, afraid of the pain that comes with caring. But yesterday, watching you stand tall even when the whole town had turned against you, I felt something shift inside me. You woke something I thought I had buried forever." Josie could hardly breathe. "Dalton, let me finish," he said gently. "Please. I am not good with words, and if I do not say this now, I might lose my nerve." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the individual gray flecks in his eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. "I want to know you, Josie Zimmerman. I want to know everything about you. What makes you laugh, what keeps you up at night, what you dream about when you let yourself dream. I want to stop running from connection and start running toward it, toward you." "I want that too," Josie whispered, her voice shaking with the force of her emotion. "I have been so alone, Dalton. So scared to let anyone get close because I could not bear the thought of losing someone else I cared about. But yesterday, when you stood up for me, When you saw me, truly saw me, and chose to help me anyway, something in me woke up too. Something I thought had died with my parents." Dalton reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. His touch was impossibly gentle, as if she were something precious and fragile. "I cannot promise I will not make mistakes," he said roughly. "I have lived alone for a long time and I am set in my ways, but I can promise I will always tell you the truth, always stand by your side, always choose you even when it is hard." "That is all I could ever ask for," Josie said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "That and one more thing." "What?" Dalton asked, his thumbs brushing away her tears with exquisite tenderness. "Kiss me," Josie said. "Please, I need to know this is real." He did not need to be asked twice. Dalton bent his head and captured her lips with his, and Josie felt the entire world fall away. There was only this moment, only the warm pressure of his mouth on hers, only the way his strong arms came around her to pull her close against his chest. She had been kissed before, brief stolen moments with boys back in Missouri who had not meant anything. But this was different. This was a promise, a claiming, a beginning of something that felt inevitable and right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably tell you I am falling in love with you," he said with a shaky laugh. "I know it is too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I have never been good at hiding my feelings. When I feel something, I feel it all the way." "Then we have that in common," Josie said, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring, "because I am falling in love with you too. Maybe I have been since the moment you spoke up in that courthouse. Maybe even before, in all those times I saw you around town and wondered about you, wondered what it would be like to know the man behind those watchful eyes." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other, marveling at the miracle of finding each other in this unlikely place at this unlikely time. Then the smell of smoke reminded Josie that she had left the flapjacks on the griddle, and they both laughed as they rushed to save breakfast from burning. They ate together at her small table, and the conversation flowed easily now, all barriers down. Dalton told her more about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands, about the rhythms of the seasons in the high country. Josie told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her mother's gentleness and her father's quiet strength, about the devastating speed with which cholera had taken them both. "I think they would have liked you," Josie said, wiping syrup from her lips with a napkin. "My father always said a man's character showed in his actions, not his words, and you have proven your character beyond any doubt." "I wish I could have known them," Dalton said sincerely. "Anyone who raised a daughter like you must have been extraordinary people." After breakfast, they walked through the town together, and this time the stares they received held a different quality. News had spread overnight about the true culprits behind the thefts. Thomas Peterson had been found with not only his mother's necklace, but also several other pieces of stolen jewelry he had taken from various homes around town. Billy Crawford had indeed been caught with the missing money and had confessed to stealing from his uncle repeatedly over the past months. And Sarah Winters had been arrested trying to flee town. A bag of stolen goods, including the banker's wife's ring found hidden under her bed. Judge Hammond himself stopped them on the street, his hat in his hands, looking thoroughly ashamed. "Miss Zimmerman, I cannot apologize enough for yesterday. We nearly committed a terrible injustice, and it would have been on my conscience for the rest of my life. The town council has asked me to offer you compensation for your ordeal and to extend our deepest apologies." "I appreciate that, Judge," Josie said with as much grace as she could muster. "Though I hope this serves as a lesson about the dangers of rushing to judgment without solid evidence." "It will," the judge assured her. "We are all deeply ashamed. And Mr. Lang, the town owes you a debt of gratitude as well. Your testimony saved an innocent woman's life and brought 3 criminals to justice. That takes real courage." Dalton shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to such public praise. "I only spoke the truth. Any decent man would have done the same. But most men did not," the judge said pointedly. "Most men stayed silent, myself included at first. You stood up when it mattered most. That is the mark of true character." As they continued their walk, more townspeople stopped to apologize to Josie and thank Dalton. Mrs. Peterson approached with tears in her eyes, begging forgiveness for her son's actions and for accusing Josie. Mr. Crawford promised her free supplies from his store for the next year as recompense. Even the women who had whispered the most vicious gossip about her now tried to make amends with forced smiles and hollow words. "How do you feel?" Dalton asked quietly as they finally escaped the center of town, heading toward the creek where Josie had been doing her washing the previous morning. "Exhausted," Josie admitted. "And angry, if I am honest. All those people who were ready to see me hang yesterday are now falling over themselves to apologize. But where were they when I needed them? Where was their sense of justice when I was being dragged through the streets?" "You have every right to be angry," Dalton said, taking her hand in his as they walked. The casual intimacy of the gesture sent warmth flooding through her. Mob mentality is a dangerous thing. People get swept up in the crowd, lose their individual judgment, become part of something ugly without even realizing it. That is why it is so important for someone to stand apart and speak truth, even when it is difficult. They sat by the creek, watching the clear water flow over smooth stones, and Josie let herself lean against Dalton's solid strength. His arm came around her shoulders, anchoring her, and she felt some of the tension of the past 2 days begin to ease. "What happens now?" she asked. "You said you were supposed to return to your cabin yesterday. Will you go back to the mountains?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment. "I need to," he said slowly. "Winter is coming, and I have preparations to make if I am going to survive the season. I need to lay in meat, chop firewood, make sure my cabin is secure against the snow." But he turned to look at her, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes that took her breath away. "But I do not want to lose what we have found here. I do not want to disappear back into the wilderness and have you forget about me." "I could never forget you," Josie said fiercely. "You saved my life, Dalton. More than that, you made me believe in goodness again, in the possibility of connection and trust. How could I possibly forget that?" "Come with me," Dalton said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it is too soon. I know it sounds insane, but come with me to the mountains. See my world, see where I live. If you hate it, if it is too isolated or too rough, I will bring you back to town immediately. But if you can see yourself there, if you can imagine building a life in that wild, beautiful place, then maybe we do not have to be apart at all." Josie's heart raced. Leave El Dorado, leave the small life she had built here, the safety of town. It was madness. They had known each other for barely 24 hours. No sensible woman would agree to such a proposition. "Yes," she heard herself say. "Yes, I will come with you." The smile that broke across Dalton's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. He kissed her again, hard and fierce and full of joy, and Josie kissed him back with equal fervor. This was crazy and reckless and completely unlike her usual cautious nature. But after yesterday, after coming so close to death for crimes she did not commit, Josie was done with being cautious. Life was too short and too precious to waste on fear. They spent the next 2 days preparing for the journey. Josie sold most of her furniture to a widow who was looking to furnish her new home, keeping only what she could carry or what had belonged to her parents and was too precious to part with. She packed her clothes, her mother's quilts, her father's pocket watch, and her small collection of books. Dalton arranged for pack mules to carry supplies up the mountain trail, laying in extra stores of flour, coffee, sugar, and other goods that would be impossible to get once winter snows closed the high passes. The women of the town, still trying to make amends for their previous behavior, threw together a hasty wedding for them. It was not a large affair, held in the small church with only a few dozen witnesses, but it was legal and binding. Josie wore a simple white dress that one of the seamstresses had worked through the night to alter for her, and Dalton wore the same blue shirt he had worn to breakfast that first morning, because she had mentioned it brought out his eyes. "Do you, Josie Zimmerman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Reverend Taylor asked, his kind face beaming at them both. "I do," Josie said clearly, looking up into Dalton's eyes and seeing her entire future reflected there. "And do you, Dalton Lang, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Dalton said, his deep voice steady and sure. "For all the days of my life. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of California, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Dalton cupped Josie's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, a promise of all the kisses to come. The small congregation applauded, and for the first time since arriving in El Dorado 2 years ago, Josie felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Not to this town, perhaps, but to this man, and he to her. They left the next morning at dawn, riding out of town on horseback with 3 pack mules trailing behind carrying their supplies. Josie looked back once at El Dorado, at the little cabin that had been her home, at the town that had nearly killed her, and then tried to make amends. She felt no regret at leaving it behind. Her life was no longer there. Her life was beside her, riding a big bay gelding, his long hair loose and flowing in the morning breeze. The trail climbed steadily into the Sierra Nevada, following rushing creeks and winding through stands of towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. The air grew cooler and cleaner as they gained elevation, and Josie felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. She had not realized how much the pressure of town life had weighed on her, the constant awareness of being watched and judged, until it was gone. They stopped frequently so Dalton could point out landmarks and wildlife, teaching her to read the signs of the wilderness. Here were elk tracks in the soft earth near a stream. There was the scraping on a tree trunk where a bear had marked its territory. Those scattered feathers meant a hawk had made a kill recently. Josie absorbed it all eagerly, feeling like she was learning a new language, one spoken in wind and stone and the calls of birds. "You are a natural," Dalton said with approval, as she correctly identified the tracks of a mountain lion near their lunch stop. "Most people from town are so overwhelmed by the wilderness they cannot see the details. But you notice everything." "I like understanding things," Josie said, munching on the bread and cheese they had brought for the journey. "My father used to say that knowledge is the best defense against fear. The more you understand about the world, the less scary it becomes." "Your father was a wise man," Dalton said. "That is exactly right. People fear the wilderness because they do not understand it. They think it is dangerous and unpredictable, but the wilderness has its own rules, its own rhythms. Once you learn them, it becomes home." They made camp that night in a small meadow beside a crystal-clear lake, the water so pure that Josie could see fish swimming near the bottom, even in the fading light. Dalton built a fire and cooked fresh trout he caught from the lake, seasoning them with wild herbs he gathered from the meadow's edge. They ate as stars began to emerge overhead, more stars than Josie had ever seen in her life, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light. "It is so beautiful," Josie breathed, leaning back against Dalton's chest as they sat by the fire. "I had no idea places like this existed." "This is nothing," Dalton said, his arms coming around her waist. "Wait until you see the view from the cabin. On a clear day you can see for 100 miles, all the way to the valley below. And in winter, when the snow covers everything, it is like living in a cloud palace, silent and white and peaceful." "Tell me about the cabin," Josie said. "I want to know everything before we arrive." Dalton described it in detail. A sturdy log structure he had built himself over the course of 2 summers, situated on a shelf of land near the tree line with a southern exposure to maximize winter sun. It had one large main room with a stone fireplace, a separate small room for sleeping, and a covered porch where he could sit and watch storms roll in across the peaks. There was a nearby spring that never froze even in the coldest weather, providing fresh water year-round. And the solitude was absolute, with the nearest neighbor more than 20 miles away. "It sounds perfect," Josie said honestly. "It sounds like exactly what I need." "What you need," Dalton echoed, surprised. "I thought you were doing this for me." "I am doing this for us," Josie corrected. "But also for myself. I realized something these past few days, Dalton. I have been hiding too, just in a different way than you. I hid behind my work, behind my careful respectability, behind keeping everyone at a distance. I told myself I was building a life in El Dorado, but I was really just existing, going through the motions without truly living. I was as isolated in that town surrounded by people as you were in your mountain cabin." She turned in his arms to face him. "But here, with you, I feel alive for the first time since my parents died. I feel like I can finally breathe. So yes, I am doing this for us, but I am also doing it for myself, because I want to know what it feels like to really live instead of just survive." Dalton kissed her then, slow and deep, and when he pulled back his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you," he said roughly. "I know I told you that before, but I need you to understand how much I mean it. You are everything I did not know I needed, everything I thought I had lost the right to hope for." "I love you too," Josie whispered. "So much that it scares me sometimes. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for this happiness to be snatched away." "Nothing is going to go wrong," Dalton promised. "We are going to build a life together up here, a good life full of love and work and simple pleasures. And when troubles come, because they always do, we will face them together. You will never be alone again, Josie. I swear it." They made love for the first time that night under the stars, gentle and careful with each other, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with the same attention Dalton had taught her to read the landscape around them. Afterward, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, Josie felt a peace settle over her that she had not known was possible. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. They reached the cabin late the following afternoon, and Josie's first glimpse of it took her breath away. Dalton had not exaggerated about the view. The cabin sat like an eagle's nest on a rocky outcrop, surrounded by twisted whitebark pines, and with the entire sweep of the Sierra Nevada spread out before it. Granite peaks marched away to the north and south, some still holding last winter's snow in their highest cirques. To the west, she could see down through layers of forested ridges to the golden grasslands of the valley far below. The cabin itself was exactly as he had described, solid and well-built, with a welcoming look despite its isolation. Smoke-blackened stones around the door spoke of many winter fires. The porch had a bench made from a split log, positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon sun. And everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of Dalton's care and craftsmanship, from the neatly stacked woodpile to the carefully banked garden plot where he grew vegetables in the short summer season. "Welcome home," Dalton said, and the word home resonated in Josie's chest like a bell. The inside of the cabin was neat and spare, exactly what she would have expected from a man living alone. But over the coming days and weeks, Josie made it theirs, adding the touches that transformed it from a shelter into a home. Her mother's quilts brightened the bed. Her few books lined a shelf Dalton built specially for them. The herbs she had brought dried from the rafters, filling the cabin with the scents of sage and lavender. They fell into an easy rhythm, sharing the work of survival in the mountains. Dalton hunted and trapped while Josie learned to cure meat and tan hides. She gathered wild plants and roots, amazed at the bounty available if you knew where to look. He taught her to shoot his rifle, patiently correcting her stance until she could hit a target at 50 yards. She taught him to read beyond the basic skills he had picked up in his youth, and they spent long winter evenings with her reading aloud from her books while he worked on carving or mending equipment. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that made the world look like it had been covered in sugar. By December, the snow was waist-deep around the cabin, and they were truly isolated, cut off from the rest of the world until spring. But Josie did not mind. If anything, she treasured the enforced solitude, the way it was just the two of them against the elements, relying on each other completely. Christmas came, and they celebrated with a feast of roasted venison and dried berry pie, exchanging small gifts they had made for each other. Dalton gave her a necklace he had carved from a piece of elk antler, intricate and beautiful. Josie gave him a shirt she had sewn from the softest deerskin, decorated with quill work in patterns she had learned from a book. "I have never been happier," Josie said as they sat by the fire that night, full of good food and contentment. "Is that strange? That I am happiest here in this isolated place, cut off from everything I used to think was important." "Not strange at all," Dalton said, pulling her close. "You have found your true self up here, just as I did years ago. Some people need the noise and bustle of town life to feel alive. Others need the silence and space to hear their own thoughts. There is no right or wrong, just different kinds of people who need different kinds of lives." Winter slowly gave way to spring, and with the melting snow came a flood of wildflowers, carpeting the meadows in sheets of color. They worked together to expand the garden, planning to grow more vegetables now that there were 2 mouths to feed. Dalton built a chicken coop, and they acquired half a dozen laying hens from a rancher in the valley, carefully carrying them up the trail in crates. "I am thinking we should get a milk cow too," Dalton said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the peaks in shades of pink and gold. "We have good grazing here in the summer, and having fresh milk and butter would be a luxury." "That sounds wonderful," Josie agreed. Then, taking a deep breath, she added, "We will need the extra food. I am pregnant." Dalton went very still beside her. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be," Josie said, suddenly nervous. They had not specifically discussed children, though she supposed it was inevitable given their active physical relationship. "I know we have only been married 6 months, and maybe this is too soon." But Dalton cut off her words with a kiss that stole her breath and her worries in equal measure. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with joy. "This is the best news you could have given me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am going to be a father. We are going to have a child, our child." "You are happy?" Josie asked, needing to hear him say it. "I am beyond happy," Dalton said, placing his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "I am terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. After Mary died, after I lost both her and her baby, I thought I would never have a family again. I thought I had lost that chance forever. But here you are, giving me everything I thought was gone. How could I be anything but happy? They made careful plans for the birth, deciding that Josie would go down to El Dorado for the final month of her pregnancy so she could be near the town doctor. As much as Dalton trusted in the natural processes of birth, he was not willing to risk anything happening to Josie or the baby because they were too far from help. "I will come with you," he said firmly when she suggested he stay at the cabin. "You think I am going to let you go through this alone? We are in this together, remember, for better or worse." "But someone needs to tend the animals," Josie protested, "and watch over the cabin." "The animals will be fine in the valley for a month," Dalton said, "and the cabin has stood empty before. Nothing up here is more important than you and our child. Nothing." The summer passed in a haze of contentment, with Josie's belly growing round and Dalton treating her like she was made of spun glass. He would not let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest frequently, and worried constantly about her health. It was endearing and occasionally frustrating, but Josie understood where his anxiety came from. He had lost his sister in childbirth. Of course he was worried. "I am strong," she reminded him regularly. "I am healthy, the baby is active, and women have been giving birth successfully for thousands of years. We are going to be fine." "I know," Dalton would say, but the worry never quite left his eyes. In early December, with snow already beginning to fall in the high country, they made the journey down to El Dorado. The town had changed little in the year since they left, though the people treated them differently now. Josie and Dalton were something of a legend, the wrongly accused woman and the mountain man who saved her, who had fallen in love and disappeared into the wilderness. People treated them with a mixture of respect and curiosity, and several of the town women were eager to help with the coming birth. They rented a small house on the edge of town, and Dalton found work at the sawmill to pay for their expenses. It felt strange to be back in civilization after months in the mountains, strange to hear the constant noise of other people, to smell the smoke and sewage and press of humanity. But it was temporary, Josie reminded herself. Soon their baby would be born, and they could return to their mountain home. The baby came on a cold January night in 1874, after a labor that lasted most of the day. Dalton stayed by Josie's side through it all, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her pregnant in the first place. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and squalling with healthy lungs, Dalton wept openly. "He is perfect," he said, cradling the tiny bundle with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man so large and powerful. "You are perfect. Thank you, Josie. Thank you for giving me this." "We made him together," Josie said tiredly but happily, watching her husband with their newborn son. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Daniel," Dalton said softly. "It was my father's name, but only if you approve." "Daniel Lang," Josie tested the name. "I like it. Welcome to the world, Daniel." They stayed in El Dorado through the worst of the winter, giving Josie time to recover and Daniel time to grow strong before the journey back to the mountains. But as soon as the spring thaw began, they were eager to return home. Town life had reminded them both why they preferred solitude, and they longed for the peace and space of their mountain cabin. The journey back was slower with an infant, requiring frequent stops for feeding and rest. But Daniel was a good traveler, seeming content whether in his mother's arms or strapped securely to his father's back in a carrier Dalton had fashioned from soft leather and lined with rabbit fur. "He is a mountain baby," Dalton said proudly. "Look how he watches everything, already learning the world around him." Reaching the cabin again felt like a homecoming in the truest sense. Everything was exactly as they had left it, the structure sound after its winter of standing empty. They opened all the windows to air the place out, swept away the dust, and made the cabin a home again. That summer and the ones that followed fell into a pattern of deep contentment. Daniel grew from infant to toddler to a sturdy little boy who could scramble over rocks like a mountain goat and identify animal tracks before he could read words. 2 years after Daniel came a daughter they named Rachel, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. 3 years after that came another son, Thomas, who seemed to fear nothing and gave his parents regular heart attacks with his fearless climbing. The years blurred together in the best possible way. Dalton's trapping business flourished, with his furs commanding top prices in San Francisco and Sacramento. Josie's garden expanded to provide most of their food through the long winters. The children grew strong and healthy, educated by their mother's books and their father's woodcraft. They made the journey to El Dorado once or twice a year, just enough to maintain connections and conduct business, but it never felt like home the way the mountain cabin did. Home was the place where they could be entirely themselves, where they could live according to their own rhythms without the weight of other people's expectations or judgments. You ever regret it? Dalton asked one evening when they were alone, the children finally asleep after a long day of play. They sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, just as they had done countless times over the years. You ever wish you had stayed in town, had a more conventional life? Never, Josie said without hesitation, taking his hand in hers. Not even for a moment. This life we have built together, this wild, beautiful life, it is everything I never knew I needed. You saved me, Dalton. Not just from that mob in El Dorado, but from a lifetime of merely existing instead of truly living. You saved me too, Dalton said, pulling her close against his solid warmth. I was so lost before you came into my life, so isolated and lonely even though I would not admit it. You brought me back to the world, reminded me that connection and love are worth the risk of pain. I am a better man because of you. We are better together, Josie said. That is the truth of it. Alone, we were both just surviving, getting through each day. Together, we are thriving. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Daniel, at 18, was the image of his father, tall and broad-shouldered with the same gray eyes and easy confidence in the wilderness. He had begun trapping his own lines, talking about building his own cabin farther up the valley where he had found a good spot near a beaver pond. Rachel, at 16, was beautiful and capable, able to shoot as well as her brother and ride better than anyone in the family. She helped her mother with the younger children and the household work. But Josie could see the restlessness in her daughter's eyes, the desire to see more of the world beyond their mountain home. Thomas, at 13, was still wild and adventurous, but beginning to show signs of his father's deep attachment to the land. They are growing up so fast, Josie said, watching her children from the cabin window. Daniel was teaching Rachel and Thomas to track a deer through the forest behind their home. Soon they will be making their own paths in the world. That is as it should be, Dalton said, coming to stand behind her and wrap his arms around her waist. His hair was more gray than black now, his face lined with the years, but to Josie, he was as handsome as the day she first saw him in that courthouse. We have given them the skills and the love they need to make good lives for themselves. Whatever they choose, wherever they go, they will carry this place inside them. You think they will stay in the mountains? Josie asked. Daniel will, Dalton said with certainty. He has the wilderness in his blood, same as me. Thomas too, probably, but Rachel. Rachel has your adventurous spirit, your willingness to take risks. I would not be surprised if she ends up in San Francisco or even farther east, making a name for herself in the world. As long as she is happy, Josie said. As long as all our children are happy, that is all I want. More years passed. Daniel did indeed build his own cabin and married a young woman from El Dorado who surprised everyone by taking to mountain life as naturally as Josie had. Rachel left for San Francisco to study music, her beautiful voice earning her opportunities to perform in fine concert halls. Thomas stayed close to home, taking over more and more of the trapping business as Dalton aged. Josie and Dalton grew old together in their mountain cabin, their bodies slower but their love as strong as ever. They spent their days in comfortable routine, tending their garden, watching for visits from their children and growing collection of grandchildren, and sitting on their porch watching the endless parade of sunsets paint their mountains in glorious color. You remember that day in the courthouse? Josie asked one evening, her head resting on Dalton's shoulder as they sat in their customary spot. The day you stood up and told the truth for me. I remember every moment of that day, Dalton said. It was the day my life truly began. Everything before that was just preparation, just surviving until I could find you. I was so terrified, Josie said. I thought I was going to die, thought my life was over at 23 years old, and then you spoke and everything changed. You gave me my life back, and then you gave me this life, this beautiful wild life I never could have imagined. We gave it to each other, Dalton corrected gently. I could not have stayed up here alone forever, Josie. The loneliness would have killed me eventually, or driven me mad. You brought meaning to my solitude, transformed it from isolation into chosen peace. Every day with you has been a gift. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, and the stars emerged, the same stars they had watched together for over 30 years. The wilderness around them sang its evening song, coyotes calling in the distance, a great horned owl hooting from the forest, the wind sighing through the pines. This was home. This was love. This was everything. I love you, Josie said softly. Then, now, always. And I love you, Dalton replied, his voice still as steady and sure as the day he had spoken vows to her in that small church. For all the days of my life. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren made the journey up to the mountain cabin for a grand celebration. There were 13 grandchildren now, ranging from babies to teenagers, and watching them play in the meadow where their own children had once played filled Josie with profound contentment. This was her legacy, this family built on truth and courage and love that had survived against all odds. Rachel had come from San Francisco with her husband, a conductor she had met during her musical career. Daniel and his wife brought their 4 children, all of them as at home in the mountains as their grandfather. Thomas and his young family lived just over the ridge now, making the journey an easy one. They filled the cabin and spilled out onto the porch and into the yard, their laughter and conversation a joyful noise that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Speech. Someone called as they gathered for dinner, the long tables groaning with food everyone had contributed. Dalton stood slowly, his hand finding Josie's and pulling her up beside him. 40 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his age. I was a man alone, convinced that solitude was safety and that connection only led to pain. Then I saw an injustice being done, and I could not stay silent. Speaking the truth that day brought me the greatest gift of my life, this remarkable woman who has been my partner, my best friend, and my love for 4 decades. He turned to look at Josie, his gray eyes bright with emotion. You have made me better than I ever thought I could be. You have given me this family, this life full of love and purpose and meaning. Every day with you has been an adventure, and I would not change a single moment of it." Josie felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. "You stood up for me when everyone else stayed silent," she said, her voice breaking. "You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You chose me, and you have kept choosing me every day since. I am the luckiest woman who ever lived." Their children and grandchildren applauded, and then everyone was talking and laughing and eating, the celebration continuing late into the night. When everyone finally settled down to sleep, bedrolls spread across every available surface, Josie and Dalton retreated to their small bedroom, tired but happy. "We did well," Dalton said, pulling her close as they settled into bed. "Look at what we built together. Look at all that love and life we created." "We did very well indeed," Josie agreed, fitting herself against his side as naturally as breathing. "And we are not done yet. We have years still ahead of us, more sunsets to watch, more grandchildren to spoil, more of this beautiful life to live." "Years and years," Dalton murmured, kissing her forehead. "I plan to annoy you for at least another decade or two," Josie laughed softly. "I look forward to it." They fell asleep in each other's arms, surrounded by their family, safe in the home they had built together. Their lives a testament to the power of truth, courage, and love. The mountains stood eternal around them, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. And in that small cabin on its rocky shelf, two hearts beat in perfect synchronization, as they had for 40 years and would for all the years remaining to them. The story that had begun with accusation and fear had transformed into one of profound love and connection, proving that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, and that standing up for truth and justice can change not just one life, but generations to come. Josie and Dalton had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built the best of lives, and their love story would be told by their descendants for generations. A reminder that courage and integrity matter, that speaking up matters, and that true love, once found, can withstand anything the world throws at it.